the Cataclysm pre-patch is officially out, and I think we all know what that means. Wrath of the Lich King Classic is finally over.
Father, is it over?
And this is something many of us have been waiting for since the days of World War hard modes. Despite Wrath of the Lich King being one of the most popular and revered expansions of all time, the Classic re-release did not hold up to the hype. In today's video, we unpack why that was, so strap yourselves in, hit the subscribe button, and try not to cringe. At first, the hype was unreal. In the expansion before that, the beginning of TBC was packed with things to do, with Season of Mastery, alts to level up, and endless Karazhans to run. But the end of it was a steady diet of the frustratingly hard Sunwell raid. Most people weren't even trying to raid, and instead opted to just sit around and wait because they knew what was to come. To some players, Wrath of the Lich King isn't just an expansion, it's the expansion. It's what they think of when they hear World of Warcraft. With Death Knights being available during the pre-patch, everybody already had theirs ready at 70 in a full PvP set. And with Death Knights being the most popular class by far, you'd be smart to avoid rolling one. You didn't want to get lost in the crowd and have to fight for a raid spot, right? Boy, how wrong that turned out to be. In the first tier, Unholy Death Knight DPS was the most ungodly, overpowered thing Classic had ever seen. Forget Warriors and Vanilla, this was something else. With the Gargoyle cooldown being snapshotable with all forms of attack power and haste with no cap, Blizzard had clearly messed up. In original Wrath of the Lich King and on private servers, the Gargoyle strike attack that the pet cast over and over couldn't be reduced below 1 second. So while it did benefit from your haste, you didn't want too much of it or else it would be wasted. But those days were long gone, and now we were seeing Gargoyles dishing out strikes in milliseconds like machine guns, killing the bosses faster than ever. Because nothing came close to its power, you wanted as many as you could get, and that meant some classes were outright excluded from the optimal raid compositions, which was understandably frustrating for those who enjoyed playing them. Blizzard eventually decided to step in and make it so the Gargoyle would not snapshot with your current stats at the time of casting the ability, and instead would update with your stats in real time. But that change came in the Ulduar raid patch, and by that time, players who did not want to be involved in the unholy shenanigans had already left. Ulduar was another revered part of WoW's history. Many noteworthy players describe it as their favorite raid of all time. I wish I could say that it lived up to the hype. And it wasn't that bad by any means, but this raid was just difficult. With almost as many bosses as Naxxramas, but each one having its own hard mode that was basically required, it resembled a time similar to Serpent Shrine Caverns and Tempest Keep in Burning Crusade, in which the average guild was going to struggle just to even finish it. Those 30-second kill times were replaced by multiple 5-minute back-to-back fights like Mimiron, Vizax, and Yogg No Lights. To remain competitive, many classes were forced to reroll Troll, because the Berserking ratio was just too good, and it was beginning to matter now more than ever. This was the case for Death Knight's last phase, but that was the first tier of the expansion, and Death Knights start at level 55 anyway, so getting one to level 80 wouldn't take that long. For the other classes, however, this was a massive commitment, and one that built all the more frustration. The ability to purchase a race change for your character was in the Wrath of the Lich King expansion anyway, and it would make Blizzard money, so why wasn't it out already? Regardless, many players I personally knew made the switch and leveled up a troll of the exact same class just to stay relevant. And speaking of frustration from high-end players, the fights in Ulduar were so annoying to min-max. The most criminal of these being Freya, that would summon a random set of adds, and if you didn't get the optimal set of them, you'd have to reset the boss and try again. Raid fights usually aren't this complicated in classic expansions, but now almost every single one of them had a skippable phase or a breakpoint that you absolutely had to accomplish with high DPS. I made a video going into more detail about these from a rogue's perspective if you'd like to check it out, but things like these were unfun and outright annoying. It was a direct decrease to your raid morale and a massive relief whenever it was finally over. You might think that the casual players who didn't have to deal with these mechanics were having more fun, but with the raid difficulty being so high, you'd be lucky to full clear the hard modes at all. The golden zone of having an effortless raid night was essentially non-existent. You were either putting in maximum effort to complete the hard modes, or maximum effort to parse on them. Guilds in the middle were pushed to a side, and no matter where you stood, it was a headache. This burned out so many people that hearing "I quit raiding in Ulduar" is a common phrase amongst the community. Just like before, there was a light at the end of the tunnel, Icecrown Citadel, yet another revered content pinnacle of the game. But this one was 2 raid tiers away. It wasn't just coming right up next. And that was too long to wait for a lot of the community. They switched to playing other games, and they caused a huge spike in the unofficial hardcore game mode on the vanilla-era servers. The next raid was Trial of the Crusader, which unlike the raid that came before it and after it, had a very negative opinion by the community. It was seen as a low-effort, filler raid, with only 5 bosses and no trash mobs. It was released with the remake of the Onyxia raid from Vanilla WoW. But because Onyxia didn't drop any items that were the same power level as the other raids, nobody really did this. I think I did maybe once. For most of the people that survived Ulduar, TOC was a clear signal that it was time to call it quits. They'd put up with all that hard work and effort for what? Just to clear this boring raid over and over? But for me at least, this was a nice break. You get done with your raids in 30 minutes or an hour every night. Really, the most annoying part of it was to go back and clear the still mandatory bosses in Ulduar, which Blizzard artificially increased the power level of, specifically so you'd have to go back and do this. Despite this, TOC was pretty chilled. I liked it, but for a lot of people, this was just not worth getting back into the game after they quit last phase. Oh, and remember that race change feature we were waiting on? They finally added that in, along with the WoW token. Just like the Gargoyle nerfs, it was a little too late, and the WoW token was just an absolute slap in the face to the Classic community. With faction chance being a completely random joke of a fight, that only left 4 bosses to parse on, and you'd think you'd be free and clear of all those pesky breakpoints by now, right? If only that were the case. We still had to deal with skipping burrow phases on Northern Beast and Anubarak. I made another video on this from a rogue's perspective, and while these fights were pretty annoying, they weren't that extremely difficult to execute. Not to mention the loot system was really unique and unlike any other raid in WoW. Not just in Classic, but as far as I know from any version of the game. In TOC, you had a limited number of 50 failed attempts on a boss before you were unable to complete the raid. I would imagine that back in the day, it was invented to prevent raids from literally coming in every single day and bashing their heads into the heroic content until they eventually cleared it. But the number of failed attempts remaining determined what you would get whenever you actually completed the raid, which included not only achievements, which, let's be honest, wasn't a big deal to most people, but also bonus loot, which was. This bonus loot was such a higher power level than the normal items, you wouldn't want to do anything to risk any of your attempts in order to maximize the amount that you received. This controversial loot system was never repeated, but it forced guilds that were effortlessly able to kill all the bosses to just do that most of the time and not push anything crazy. Combined with actually limiting the number of attempts, this meant that in that last week, if you weren't able to perform these breakpoint skips with those 50, you actually just weren't going to be able to get these done. And with that foreshadowing, it's finally time to talk about the raid behemoth of the expansion, Icecrown Citadel. In the memory of millions, this was the most epic raid in WoW history. But by the time we finally got there, most people had already quit. And the few who were left quickly became overwhelmed and frustrated due to its difficulty level. With the raid being so huge, of course there were some fights that were a total cakewalk, but there were still some that stuck out like a sore thumb and caused many migraines and long raid nights. Just like back in the day, the longer and more complicated fights like Putricide and Sindragosa were torture chambers, but nothing came close to the absolute absurdity of heroic 25-man Lich King. Just like other epic final bosses like Lady Vosh or Illidan, this fight was pretty much like 10 minutes long. And if you made a mistake at any of that time, it could cause you to wipe and start all over again. ICC is the only raid in the game that Blizzard decided to make easier over time, not with nerfs to the bosses, but with a simple buff that increased your damage, healing, and health by 5% per week, capping out at 30%. Now this was originally intended to help even the most casual of players be able to experience the fall of the Lich King, even if it's on 10-man normal mode. But since that actually happened about 15 years ago now, and we'd all experienced it, surely they wouldn't just do that again for no reason, right? And if they did, they would just have that buff out right away. No, it was re-implemented exactly the same as it was the first time. And it absolutely butchered the raid morale. Why would you ever try to improve whenever things are just going to be 5% easier next week? If you were lucky enough to stick around the entire tier and wanted to parse in the final weeks, you were met with the most mathematically impossible task of no-rooming heroic Lich King. You know in Phase 3 whenever Arthas pulls everybody into Frostmourne and you have to dodge the relentless spirits chasing you? Well, you're not able to hit the boss that whole time that you're in there, and that's a pretty big DPS loss. But there is time when you can hit the boss during the transition from Phase 2 to 3. Mages with extra range talented could hit Arthas in the middle of the room without getting hit by Remorseless Winter. Melee weren't so lucky and had to endure the insane frost damage. It was still really intense. I don't know how many guilds successfully no-roomed the fight, but it wasn't a lot. And due to the excessive difficulty of performing the no-room strategy, if you didn't do something perfect in the earlier phases that messed up your parse, you were just happy that you got it done. Back in the day, we knew that ICC was the last raid of the expansion, and Lich King was the final boss, so after defeating him, many people just chose to quit, and not stick around for the dead time until the next expansion. With how extremely difficult killing him at all was, farming this boss was something no one had the motivation to do, and so we saw this repeat. Official hardcore vanilla WoW servers were out, and that was the popular thing to be doing. But soon, when Season of Discovery was announced, a ton of the people still playing Wrath decided to jump ship. We don't have any real numbers on how many people were still clearing ICC. All we have to go off of is the Warcraft log raid data. But most of the people still around at this point weren't interested in playing other versions of WoW, so they locked this in as their main game. And the only thing left to do was raid on as many characters as you want, and due to GDKPs, you could just buy gear on these new characters. Still, even including all of these alts, outside of an expansion launch where people can't raid, this was an all-time low for people raiding in Classic. It didn't help that the upcoming expansion Cataclysm has very mixed opinions. For some, there's not that much reason to stick around, and they were just looking for a reason to quit, because they knew that they would quit by the end of Wrath anyway. But still, I personally think that we could have seen an expansion that lived up to its former glory if things had been handled smoother. So what happened? GDKPs that were going absolutely wild, combined with the WoW token and armies of unmoderated bots selling gold, obviously ruined the game. Unholy Death Knights obviously shouldn't have run rampant for an entire phase, and obviously when the bosses are so hard to execute that you can't parse, players who like to parse aren't really going to be having any fun. It really felt like Blizzard did not care about you enjoying the game the entire time, and they were committed to really moving forward with these outlandish alterations regardless. I could go on and on about my frustrations, but just like the retail expansions, we've seen a massive overcorrection from the developers with Season of Discovery, changing things multiple times a week. So frequently that I can't even really make videos on it because it becomes outdated in less than a month. In summary, Wrath of the Lich King was a great expansion. The content is top-notch, and it still deserves a place in your heart, despite the false version that we got this time around. I hope in the future we can find that middle ground, where we get what we want and nothing more, nothing less. Changes when they're needed and not simply wanted. But that's it for me. Thanks for watching the video. Like it if you liked it, and see you next time.
No king rules forever, my son.
I see only darkness.